Welcome back to day 2 of Politico Europe Sustainable Future Summit. I'm America Hernandez, energy policy correspondent, here to discuss the future of Europe's green energy with a smorgasbord of amazing guests today. We have Director General for Energy, Dita Juul-Jorgensen, here from the Commission. We have Laura Cozzi, Chief Modeler for the International Energy Agency in Paris. We have Martin O'Neill, Vice President for Strategy at GE Power. And we have a green member of the European Parliament, Marie Toussaint. I would like to remind everyone to submit questions via the Swapcard platform. We do have a poll that I'm going to present now, and during the course of the talk, you can go ahead and pick which answer you feel most appropriate. We'll read the results at the end. It's which on-demand power source is best placed to balance renewable energy intermittency? And we have as options gas turbines, hydropower, nuclear, and batteries or other storage technology. So hopefully some of the questions that come up in this debate will give you a chance to decide which you think is the best answer. But just to set the scene again, as you've heard a few moments ago, February 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine and completely upended the global energy landscape, and for Europe in particular, we've lost our major natural gas supplier. In about 5 days' time, we're getting set to implement a partial EU embargo on Russian oil. And it has put a lot of pressure on the European Commission to decide on a new path forward for meeting its green climate goals. So I'd actually like to start with DG Jorgensen. If you could just let us know how the Commission has sort of reacted to this challenge, because the Green Deal was set up in a completely different context when everything was fine and it was a voluntary choice. And now it's really another animal. So, what are you looking for as the main challenges in the next 6 months ahead? What needs to be done?
Well, thank you, America, and thank you very much for the invitation. I think, as Fatih Birol said in the previous session, the Green Deal and our response to the Russian war in Ukraine, our response to the energy crisis, are completely aligned. And so, if anything, this current energy crisis is actually accelerating and pushing ahead with the Green Deal and the green transition, because the green transition is the best answer both to more affordable energy, to sustainable energy, and to secure energy. So, just a few words about how that works in practice. Our response to the Russian disruption of energy, of Russia's weaponization of energy to the European Union, was Repower EU. Repower EU is how do we make ourselves independent on Russian fossil supplies. Before the war, we were dependent at 40% on Russian fossil gas for our overall gas consumption. That's a very, very high level of dependency on any one supplier. So that is what has to change. It's become clear that that one very significant supplier is not a reliable supplier. So our response, as I said, was Repower EU, and Repower EU rests on 3 pillars. The first pillar is to reduce our consumption, so energy savings, energy efficiency, fuel switch wherever that is possible and relevant, process optimization, essentially doing what we do but doing it smarter. So that aligns with the energy efficiency objective of the European Green Deal. The second pillar is renewable energy. So replace as much as possible of our energy use with renewable sources. So replacing fossil with renewables where we can, accelerating investments into renewables, scaling up renewables, for example, by offshore wind, where we can reach completely different levels of output compared to other sources, but also by small local sources, photovoltaic, for example. And then the third pillar is replacing. Where we need molecules, we need to replace the Russian molecules with other molecules, other sources. And that can, of course, ideally be green sources, biomethane or green hydrogen based on renewables. But it will also have to be fossil gas, natural gas, over the coming decades. We're still going to need that in our system. So we're turning to trusted suppliers, trusted partners, and we've increased our supplies from them through our outreach, through our energy diplomacy and other actions.
How's that going?
Well, so far it's been going very well. Because if you look at Europe in 2022, we have lost very significant amounts of natural gas, of fossil gas, that would normally have come by pipeline from Russia. And that has been replaced. It has been replaced partly by lower demand. It has been replaced by fossil gas, LNG, primarily from other sources, and it has been replaced by the scaling up of renewables. So what we've set ourselves out to do in Repower, we're already doing. What we're now saying under Repower EU is, let's accelerate that, let's do more of that. So we know what the pathway is, because it is the European Green Deal, but we need to do more of it and faster, and we need to work with reliable partners like the US, Norway, Azerbaijan, Algeria, to mention just some of the ones that are our most significant suppliers, but others as well globally.
Okay, I'd like to actually maybe turn now to Mr. O'Neill, just to get the kind of supplier and producer perspective on this, because I'm hearing a lot of renewable, and I think in a lot of people's minds they forget intermittent. You know, we talk about energy security. You know, what jumps on your mind when you hear Jørgensen talk about this doubling down on green energy?
Yeah, I think first of all, GE has a unique lens on this question because we actually supply into the renewable segment as well as more conventional types of power like nuclear, gas turbines, hydro, and even coal-fired steam turbines. So the way that we look at the energy transition is there's a certain amount of rotating synchronous assets that you need to have on grids for stability and for backup power.
In layman's terms, if you don't mind, I'm just going to...
Yeah, it's often missed, but look, on a grid that's transmitting power and distributing it to your homes and to factories and industry, there are events that happen during the day where there could be a large power surge or there could be a large drop-off of power if any one of those generation assets trips out. And you need to be able to rapidly ramp power and bring it onto the grid to provide stability. Otherwise, the grid kind of tries to self-heal itself, and the only way to do that is to rapidly, you can't really store electrons, so demand and supply need to be matched in real terms, in real time. And that means that some of the challenges that renewables bring to grids that were designed in the 1950s and 60s and built out in the 70s and 80s is they were designed with synchronous rotating assets in mind. Big turbines, big steam turbines, big generators. The more renewables you add onto the grids, the more noise you put into that rotating synchronous system. We are really excited about the addition of offshore wind, onshore wind, more solar, inverter-based resources. So they're not directly coupled. They use power electronics to couple those electrons onto the grid. So you still need an amount of rotating synchronous balancing capability in order to actually allow to add renewables even faster. And I think that just the very short sort of Cliff Notes version of this is, if you want to add more renewables fast, you need to make sure that you have real-time balancing capability in synchronous assets, and that those assets can then be decarbonized into subsequent decades. So when I hear a narrative about gas as a bridging fuel, that definitely resonates with us. We think that gas turbines are the perfect complement for renewables acceleration and growth. And ultimately, what is natural gas fuel today could be displaced by synthetic gas, e-methanol, or hydrogen in the future. So I think there's a decarbonization path for those assets. But let's not miss the fact that you need those assets for the grids to operate safely and reliably. And I think energy security is really top of mind now, and has perhaps changed the complexion of some of the investments that we need to be making. Just a final point to get off this, I think whilst there's a lot of goodwill and stated desires to achieve certain objectives by 2030, I really, really think that we need to find a way to accelerate fast-track siting and permitting for more renewables, for transmission and distribution investments, and we need to look in the face of gigawatt capacity shortfalls that we're going to have with firm thermal dispatchable power as well. So I think we just need to have a bit more of a balanced narrative than perhaps it's all about renewables and batteries, because that's not how the physics works. It's not just about renewables and batteries.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I recall when the 10E regulation, that's Trans-European Networks for Energy Regulation, was being negotiated. There was the last-minute agreement with countries in the room where somebody wrote on the back of an envelope, you know, we're going to be able to have more gas-fired plants, but, you know, the plants and the pipelines all have to be 100% hydrogen by 2030. That was kind of the new path that was set. But on the subject of, you know, renewable permitting, a lot of the Repower EU legislation that has come up has acknowledged the need for, some of that oil infrastructure still, some of rejigging gas infrastructure, because we're realizing, Russian gas used to come from east to west. Now we're having to deal with LNG coming from outside in. So there is that sort of reaction we see from the European Commission coming, but a lot of criticism, perhaps from a democratic point of view, given that a lot of these are passed through the emergency procedure. I'm thinking of Article 122, where countries with the Commission sort of decide to adopt. And on that point, I'd like to turn to MEP Toussaint, because from the point of view of the European Parliament, it's quick action, but you're a bit watching on the sidelines. And so, what is your take, both as a member of the Greens, but as a member of the European Parliament, in sort of watching the crisis without necessarily being able to have your vote taken into account?
Yeah, that is somehow problematic for democracy, and also pushing for quick decisions to be taken in time of emergencies. And we've seen that also with civil liberties. When we take decisions, sometimes we just erase some of the protections that we had settled, and it's really hard to come back to that. But first, if you allow me, there are two things that I want to raise here, and especially to Politico itself. First is that the first one is good, the second one a bit more critical. But the first thing is that it's quite rare to have mostly women discussing about energy. In the European Commission, we have a women commissioner, we have a women DG, and a women president, so that's changing, but it's still quite hard to find such tables with women discussing about these issues. So thanks for that. However, what I want to raise on a more critical side is that one of the issues that we have in the Parliament and in the European Union, and this is really linked actually to your question, is that we are still in a corporate capture decision. What I mean by that is that at European level, this is still the gas operators doing the analysis of the needs, doing the estimations of the needs, and evaluating as well how much money they need for operating gas. When you have such a situation, then it's not possible to really have a democratic point of view with the intervention of public entities like Acer. I mean, we increased a bit the role of Acer.
That's the Agency for Corporation of Energy Regulators, just for those at home who aren't familiar with the acronym.
Thank you. Yeah, we have to remind that. But also the climate board was supposed to tell us what's good for the climate to reach our goals that we adopted with the European Union, and of course civil societies and all kinds of energy operators. So we have this situation, and this is then really hard to get away from gas when you have such a corporate capture of decisions. So this is still something that we're fighting on. We're making a bit of progress, but it's still not ruled, right? And we saw as well in the COP27, again, that the fossil fuel lobbies were the most numerous delegation of the COP for the second time in a row. And of course, this is also corporate capture of decisions. And here we also have sponsors that are coming from the fossil fuel or the plastic companies being here and allowing financing this kind of event. And I just want to say, when we are a media, we're supposed to defend democracy and public interest, and this is quite hard. And I'm sorry to have to raise that.
Not at all.
But this is quite hard to be here and see those logos of financiers being here. And this is not about General Electric being around the table. This is really about the sponsoring and the financing of the event. So there is a campaign led by civil society, which is called Fossil-Free Politics, who are pushing to get rid of this capture, corporate capture of decisions. And I think this is really important. So to get back to your question now.
I would very much like that, and I would just like to add here, I thank you for coming on, because as you know, we do have corporate sponsors. We have GE happy to sit on this event. We have the DG here, but too many times, some people say, if that person's on the panel, I'm not going to be on the panel. So I am really happy that for this type of a discussion, we have many parties represented. And I would very much like to hear your answer to my question.
Okay, that's good. So your question was, what's the role of the European Parliament, and then how is the green approach, right? well, so we are living in this situation of emergency. So the Commission had to come up with quick procedures for, I mean, since February now, since the war in Ukraine. These are procedures where the Parliament doesn't really have a word in the discussion. I mean, we try to jump into the discussion, so we take resolutions, we invite the commissioners and the member states to come in, so we impose ourselves in the overall debate, but we are not the ones voting on the decisions that are being taken by the member states. And as I said before, in situation of emergencies, at the same time very understandable, but at the same time really problematic for European democracy to just get rid of the decision of the only universal direct people that are elected by the Europeans in such an important discussion. So we try to jump in, but in the European Parliament we have kind still of the same political discussions, right? So we have those who want to go towards emergency measures. We have those who want a lot of money to be on the table, others who want to limit the money. We have those who are pushing quite a lot to relaunch fossil fuels, and especially natural gas, of course. And we have all those decisions, and the Greens defending other solutions. So we have all those discussions that are quite similar to the ones being on the table on the European Union level. But then I want also to react to what Dieter said. You talked about the third pillar, which is replacing. Our fear as Greens is that this third pillar is actually becoming the first one. Right? And that we can see that member states, sometimes for energy security reasons, but sometimes also for reasons of competition among the member states, right? They want to be the ones that receive the gas and that sell them to the other countries. I'm French, so I know what I'm talking about. They are launching new infrastructure, whereas in the TENI discussion that we had, and that was quite difficult, but last year we're kind of deciding that we would get rid at some point of natural gas. And now we are seeing all these new projects, infrastructures, of course. Some say that it will be temporary, but we have actually no clue how long it's going to last. And the most often when you invest, you want to have a return on your investment, so you don't know how long it's going to take. But also long-term contracts being signed and new exploitations of fossil fuels in third countries being invested into. So all of this makes the replacing diversification becoming the first pillar, whereas the first pillar should stay the reduction of the consumption of energy, should stay energy efficiency. And maybe just to take one example, I mean, we have a lot of emergency measures that we can take, for instance, the interruptibility mechanisms that are being adopted currently by some member states to ensure that everyone has energy during the winter.
And when you say interruptibility mechanisms, I'm so sorry, just to be, do you mean blackouts, maximum consumption? What exactly, for the layperson at whom may not understand?
Yeah, I mean, at EU level, but also in the member states, you have mechanisms that say that if you have a shortage of energy, then you can somehow cut or diminish the energy that is being used by the biggest consumers, which would be the industries, and with attention, of course, cautiousness on hospitals, schools, public services, and also a call, which we will see if it's going to be respected or not, but a call to protect households from those energy cuts. So that's something that is in the law that we can, use and activate whenever we want. But we also have to change completely the overall system, because it's not only about passing this winter or even the next one, it's about protecting the climate and ensuring a planet that is livable for everyone, right? So we have to change the system. And what we see now is that 64% of the gas used by the European industry, 64%, can be replaced in only a few months by major technologies in renewables. So of course, this is about getting the right material, the right human resources for doing this change, but this would be a definitive change that would allow us to reduce our energy consumption. And I think that's the way we should take to really change the economic and energetic model that we have right now.
All right. Well, I think that's actually the perfect moment to pivot to Laura Cozzi from the International Energy Agency, because there are indeed a lot of fears that this rush to sign long-term agreements for gas may set the world back in terms of its climate goals. What are you seeing as far as, new production coming online? Are we going backwards? And where do the renewables stand as far as Europe and the world and the pace of rollout?
Thanks a lot, Augusta. Maybe I would, if you allow me, take the current situation where we are in globally and in Europe specifically. So this incredible energy crisis we are in, and tell you the lessons that we understood from the 70s when we were doing the World Energy Outlook this year. So if we go back to the 70s and today, there is a big parallel. Back then in the 70s, 100% of the countries in the world were suffering from very high level of inflation that was energy driven. We are today in exactly the same situation. What happened in the 70s is that countries basically managed to do two things. They first managed to push nuclear. 40% of the global installed nuclear capacity today was installed in the 70s, and the result of that was we stopped using oil in the electricity sector. So this, in the 70s, produced a big shift. We were using oil to produce electricity. At the end of the 70s, that was it, finished. Now, what we are seeing now is natural gas is one of the key pillars globally to produce electricity, and our expectation is that what has happened to oil in the 70s is going to happen to natural gas in the power sector this decade.
With nuclear?
No, with renewables. This is a big shift, because in the 70s, we did not have renewables as cheap as today.
Okay.
So what we are seeing is a huge push of renewables. We are seeing incredible numbers in the EU, but we are seeing incredible numbers in China. We are seeing incredible numbers in the US, and this is really pushing out gas out of the power sector. So our expectation for increase in gas demand globally this decade is very, very different from what we were expecting last year.
A step change.
Completely different. So last year we were expecting a very significant growth in natural gas bridge fuel. This year we are expecting a growth to 2030 globally of only 5%.
5% in the
Why
next 10
is that?
years. Okay.
Yeah, why is that? So renewables are very cheap. They are coming online in Europe because we have a crisis. What's happening in the emerging world? You mentioned Pakistan earlier. Today, investing in a CCGT, so a gas-fired plant that produces electricity in the emerging world, is not a business. It's too expensive, far too high costs, and geopolitically, it's too large a risk. So we are going to miss 5 years, and in 5 years' time, renewables are going to be even cheaper, and they are going to be pushed even more. So the first thing that is happening. So a big change in natural gas markets for this decade. Okay. A second lesson that I would like to take from the 70s and we are seeing happening this decade, again, maybe going back with the very important point on demand. In the 70s, what happened? Regulation, very strong regulation on cars. Of course, back in the 70s, it was an oil crisis. Today is everything. So what happened? We started at the beginning of the 70s. The cars sold were 20 liters per 100 kilometers. At the end of the 70s, they're consuming half of that. What's happening now? The parallel that we are seeing, huge growth in electric vehicles. So by 2030, we are expecting in Europe, in the US, in China, 1 in 2 cars being electric. Now, the big other parts that I think we should really focus on, and Europe is starting, but is going to be the next phase, is really electrification of heat. So this, I think, is going to be the critical aspect, especially for gas in Europe. The largest consumer of gas today is not the power sector, is heating in buildings.
Absolutely.
I'll stop here.
And I'm going to pivot to you, but I must remind all of the viewers watching, you still have time to answer the poll, so tap to it. But no, I'm very interested in this because you mention renewables, you mention heating in buildings, and the first thing that jumps in my mind is the renovation wave. When the Green Deal came out, there was this idea, we're going to roll out energy efficiency renovations, we're going to put heat pumps and everything, and then it sort of fell down a little on the agenda, at least from the outside view. A lot of, the pandemic happened, this happened, and a lot of people are saying, the IEA has its heat pump strategy coming out today. What needs to happen? Can we get that going? Are you working on that? Because renewables, the permitting is, hopefully will speed up, but it's been needing to speed up for some time. So What's the work on the buildings?
Well, if I start with permitting, because permitting is a central point both in terms of energy efficiency, what needs to be done there, but even more in terms of renewables. So what we have done on permitting to accelerate is, first of all, in the regulatory field, in the Renewable Energy Directive that is currently under discussion with Parliament and Member States, so to upgrade our Renewable Energy Directive. In addition to that, we have made further suggestions, more ambitious suggestions in Repower EU, so a further strengthening of permitting, a further acceleration of permitting, and then to cover the crisis, to make sure we do what we need to do, not in 2 years, but here and now. We have made an emergency proposal to accelerate on a temporary basis permitting for renewables, looking at overriding public interest and looking at specific elements of renewables, photovoltaic on roofs, heat pumps as another element of that. And if I may just do a little bracket here, because I think you raised some critical points on the democracy in times of emergency. How do we make sure that we act swiftly, decisively, and do the right thing aligned with our long-term strategic objectives, while we make sure that we protect democracy and have a good interinstitutional process, which is part of how we operate, central to how we operate. So just a moment on those, and then I will come back to the permitting. So the way we have approached it is we have to act very, very swiftly. So when we need something temporary on an emergency basis, we have had to have recourse to the emergency article of the European Treaty, Article 122, as you referred to. Whenever possible, we don't use that article, we use the normal the ordinary legislative procedure. We did it with the storage regulation, and as I said, we're doing it with permitting as well. So whenever possible, we of course use the more structural approach in working with the Parliament. When we use the emergency procedure, we make sure that we work closely with Parliament. We've set up a contact group on energy to make sure that there is actually an ongoing dialogue, ongoing close consultation, cooperation with Parliament. And then the other thing that's important is that for each of these emergency measures, we need to look at, do we need them now on a temporary basis, or do they actually have a more structural relevance in our energy legislation, in our energy system? And so we cover the immediate emergency by these emergency tools, but we also need to look at, together with the European Parliament, together with Member States, well, maybe some of these things that we've done in a crisis actually prove to have a longer validity, a longer relevance in the system. And if that is the case, well, then this emergency measure is just a bridge towards something more permanent. To give you one example, we've made a proposal for, in order to increase our supplies, we've made proposals for demand aggregation under a European platform for joint purchasing, and that is a question of, well, this is something that would typically be more structural, more permanent in order to really take off. And so we have a temporary measure, but let's look at how do we bring that forward. So I think just to address these points, because they are critical, the points you're making about the role of the European Parliament and making sure that we are fully respectful of the democratic principles and working methods, also in times of crisis. So permitting is one example of having done both. Heat pumps and the renovation wave remain top of the agenda. As we have just talked about, the first pillar in Repower EU is reducing consumption, energy efficiency, energy savings, and buildings are critical in that. As you've said, it is such a significant part of our energy consumption, so we can really change things there. We do that both in our regulation. Again, we've got the energy performance of buildings that is being upgraded as part of the ordinary legislative procedure. We are upgrading our energy efficiency directive, both as part of the Green Deal, but linked to Repower as well. And then, of course, we've got the recovery facility, where member states are including each in their national plans significant measures for energy efficiency and renovation. The renovation wave, renovation of buildings towards energy efficiency, is a central part of that in some member states with very, very high levels of ambition, so you can really change things.
Okay.
And just one word on heat pumps, because it is such an important aspect. Overall, the electrification of our appliances, the electrification of our energy systems saves us a lot. So even if that electricity comes from coal, and less should come from coal, but even if it does come from coal, then these electrical appliances are simply cleaner and better in terms of energy consumption and in terms of the CO2 emissions. So heat pumps are an example. If you look at the numbers in Poland during this energy crisis, the investment into heat pumps, the rollout of heat pumps across Poland are so impressive. So there's a real shift there, and more can be done. So I think your report on heat pumps is very, very timely once again.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for that. And just as a reminder to those in the audience, we will have a 10 minutes live Q&A. So if you have questions, prepare yourselves. We'll have people ready to run with microphones so that you don't have to shout for me to hear you. But I do want to just quickly follow up on that quickly, because you say renovation wave is the top of the agenda. You know, you mentioned Poland and you mentioned ambition, right, in the recovery and resilience plans. But there is ambition and then there is action. And I recall that when renovations were first being discussed, there was this moment where the Commission said, well, we can't just jump there right in. You know, we need to be able to evaluate and create the sort of building passport for everyone. We need to know where we are before we can renovate so we know how much we're saving. And yet, on the other hand, we have people saying, you know, we may not be able to buy the gas that we need or et cetera, you know, this winter, but we could, you know, renovate massively, quickly now. What is holding that back?
Is not being held back. Renovations are taking place across Europe every day, driven partly by the market. Energy prices are so high, so there's a very significant interest at the level of the consumers, at the level of the industry, in making the change that is necessary. So I think it comes back to some of the points you've made and Fatih Birol made in the previous session, that this energy crisis, the high energy prices, are a significant driver of the transition as well. And we need to make sure we make the best use of that so that we make the changes that are necessary as swiftly as possible. So we can, at the same time, renovate, change what we do and how we do it, and in parallel to that, carry out the assessments, the analysis to make sure that we target it better and better over time. It's not one or the other. We can, I think it's called walk and chew gum or something is the expression.
Walk and chew gum.
Or whatever the expression is, but you can't do both at the same time.
Okay, all right, noted. The Commission can walk and chew gum at the same time. Any reactions immediately here just on the panel before we throw? Mr. O'Neill?
Yeah, I think basically I'd just like to react in general to the role that GE plays in this ecosystem, first of all, and then maybe to just underline a few technologies and some issues that I think maybe we haven't talked about enough. First of all, the participation of companies like General Electric in the discussion is critical. Directly or indirectly through our customers, 1/3 of the world's electricity is produced from GE machinery. And that is a legacy that's been built up over a century. Decades of billion-scale investments coming from the private sector. So government and industry need to find a way to work together. I think we need to acknowledge that openly and celebrate that, first of all. Secondly, I think, you know, some of the conversations that we've been having about technology X versus technology Y, where to focus and prioritize, I think that we need to recognize that even within the EU 27, there's massive diversity in the starting position of different countries. A lot of installed base nuclear, a lot of coal in Germany, for example. So lots of effervescent narrative around hydrogen in the future, but right now we're burning more coal in Germany than prior years because of energy security concerns. So the faster we can pivot that to gas, we should do that, because that's going to be 1/3 of the CO2 burden versus coal. And then ultimately that technology is not, it's not married to burning natural gas. We can decarbonize it with carbon-free fuels. I would love for us to have a more effervescent technology-based discussion which is really linked to market incentive instead of this sort of constant back and forth about good technology, bad technology. I think we should be talking about tightening carbon prices. I think we should be talking about economic stimulus in market design for the technologies that actually work and respect the physics of how grids have been designed and built. And I think in some of the net zero projections and some of the optimistic narrative, a lot of those actual physics-based principles get lost. You need a diverse portfolio of generation assets for your grid to function and to be stable and dependent. And more than ever, we're seeing that right now. So we can't just cross out one technology. We need to invest heavily. I mean, Germany, for example, is going to have a 34 gigawatt capacity shortfall by 2030 for thermal dispatchable power. We need to make sure that whatever technology we put in the ground for that can ultimately be decarbonized. And that's why I think we should look more at market incentive and shift the narrative away from technology X versus technology Y. It's a little bit oversimplistic.
So it's interesting that you mentioned Germany, because I recall we had a German Green MEP on a few months ago who said better to burn coal longer, to switch to renewables rather than switch to gas. But I'd like to go to MEP Tucson because I have a feeling she has something to say on the point.
Yeah, thank you. And I would say two things. The first one, because that's also the question behind, and the poll showed it, which kind of energy do we need? And that's why the reduction of energy is so important. I mean, it's obvious, but it's better being said. The best energy, but also the most affordable one, is the one that we don't use. That's the one who doesn't destroy the planet. And with the current way of how the price of energies work, the biggest consumers have an influence on the prices for everyone, and even the most vulnerable. Sorry. So that's really an emergency right now. I think that's the emergency that we have. Then about the emergency, I believe that at the beginning of the war we were in a situation of emergency, but right now the emergency is lasting, right? So I would also really think that emergency measures, now we should be into a more regular process. And I just want to point out still that the European Parliament, within the gas emergency stockage resolution, before even the Commission came up with proposals and then the Council agreed, managed to come up with proposals that we Greens liked, for instance, efficiency, for instance, targets for reduction of use of electricity and gas. And we came up with, also as a parliament, with proposals that the Greens don't like new gas security of supply infrastructure. What that means is that the parliament is also able to work quite quickly. So that's, even emergency is not always a reason to cut us off. But on the issue also of renovation wave, I have very different feeling than Dieter, actually, because I feel like if we hadn't done it before for climate, from the 24th on February onwards, we should have seen, we hear work right now in the buildings, but we should have seen in all of our member states, in all of our cities, in all of our streets, those renovations that we are still waiting for. So I pretty much share your feeling that this is not coming. And that we are living a very hard situation of energy precarity also, that should really push member states especially to go quicker. We are not seeing that coming, really, and there is a shortage of human resources, as I pointed out before. There is a shortage of materials, but there are still things that can be done, and really I don't see the feeling of emergency here. I see rather the member states jumping and rushing to gas, as I said before, and not rushing so much towards the renovation. And something that we have to say, that we have to fight for right now, is really the recognition at European level of the right to energy. The right to energy doesn't mean that everyone can waste all the energy that they want. This is not about it. It's like the right to water. It's to say that an amount of energy is necessary to protect the dignity of people, and that people should have access to this amount of energy that is sufficient to preserve their dignity, the fact that they live rather than survive, but also an energy that doesn't destroy neither the health nor the planet. And I think that this is really something that the EU should rush to right now, and this is the real emergency that we have to solve.
All right. Thank you so much. I think now we can turn to live questions in the room. If anybody has a hand that they want to raise, after a few messages that we will hear first. But in a second, we will hear those students on the screen, and I'd like to ask you all quickly, do you have a Christmas wish from the EU to move all of each of you just quickly, about 10 seconds? What is your one Christmas wish that you feel the European Commission could just successfully speed through to move forward?
Well, if it's beyond the field of energy, then I think it is that Ukraine is Ukraine and can live in peace in its territory. So I think that's the obvious first wish for everyone. If it's in the field of energy, I think I would wish for continued EU unity. I think European member states and working with the European Parliament, we have shown that we are able to act swiftly within our democratic institutions, and I think that our aim should be to continue that.
Okay, Ms. Kausi, your Christmas wish for the EU.
I think EU is doing extremely well in terms of crisis. So I think first thing we need to applaud them. And the second, I would like to say there is a lot already ongoing, but tackling the heating gas demand, that's going to be the critical issue for the next year as well.
Okay, all right, Mr. O'Neill.
I would just say very quickly that we could reduce siting and permitting by more than 50%. Currently takes 6 to 8 years, whether it's for renewable transmission and distribution interconnections, just the time that it's going to take to add new power. If we're celebrating heat pumps, electrification of industry, the addition of electric vehicles, that's all wonderful. We're putting more and more load onto a very stressed grids. We need to find a way to do that. The clock's ticking. 2030 is around the corner. When I'm trotting off numbers that are double-digit shortfalls in gigawatt capacity, the problem we need to all solve together, all of industry, with the politicians, with the EU, is the speed it takes to do this stuff.
Okay, thank you. And maybe Toussaint, your Christmas wish for the European Commission.
I, of course, have wish for Ukraine. I have wishes for the climate and for the people. But what I want to say right now is that the EU and the member states have to acknowledge the fact that nuclear is actually creating wastes for generations and generations, dangerous waste that we cannot wait on future generations with this waste, that they are also a very dangerous kind of energy, as we can see right now in Ukraine, and that this is also more expensive now, as Laura said, than renewables. So I would really wish for the EU not to open the door to the EU financing of nuclear. I think this is absolutely essential, and that we should stay the way we are right now, and even push the member states to get out of this very dangerous energy.
Okay, thank you so much. And now a few messages, and we'll be right back for a live Q&A. Thank you.
This is an age of disruption, of profound revolutionary change.
What we're really asking ministers is to empower the ambassadors.
The only thing that you really push forth is the truth.
You don't see many women represented when it comes to the decisions as to how to handle the pandemic.